According to a report by the National Registry of Exonerations, official misconduct is at the root of more than half of all exoneration cases. BNC's Narissa Knight has more on Richard E. Jackson, the former Dallas County prosecutor who permanently lost his license to practice law in Texas again.
Oh, this is an epic day.
34-year-old Mayan Burrell was recently released after spending more than 18 years in prison. He was wrongfully convicted and given a life sentence at 16 years old after a stray bullet killed an 11-year-old. We caught up with Burrell in George Floyd Square in Minneapolis after Burrell met with and hugged people who allegedly withheld video that would have proven his innocence.
I was just released from prison after spending more than 18 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit.
Are you mad? Are you resentful?
Like, what do you mean by that?
And whoever's fault it was, you didn't do the crime.
Of course, it's going to be some anger, but more than that, I'm motivated. I'm motivated to actually change the conditions of my people.
While Burrell was convicted in Minnesota, the states with the highest wrongful conviction rates are Illinois, Pennsylvania, Texas, and New York. Last month, the Texas Bar Association stripped the law license of a former Dallas County prosecutor, Rick Jackson, who withheld evidence that resulted in 2 capital murder convictions of black men 20 years ago. They were recently freed. Chairman of the Texas Bar Association Law Practice Management Committee, Stephen Bolton, says prosecutorial misconduct is unacceptable, and that's why the state had to take action.
In this case, the prosecutor failed to follow the Constitution and provide information that showed the innocence of these 2 defendants, and it's totally unacceptable.
And he was disbarred.
Yes, he relinquished his license and is no longer a practicing lawyer in Texas.
While righting wrongs is good and a start, it doesn't give Mayan or the more than 2,500 others who've been wrongfully convicted since 1989 their years and lives with loved ones back.
So I'm doing everything in my power to channel the energy that I have and the pain from the deprivation, from the trauma, and channel it to actually push for change with my people, you know what I mean? Take them up out of an oppressed state.
Let's bring back BNC's legal contributor and veteran prosecutor, Paul Henderson. All right, Paul, we both prosecuted, and I'm sure we've got tons of stories about prosecutorial misconduct that we've seen firsthand go unchecked. So this case coming out of my old office is a rare example of severe punishment for misconduct in a wrongful conviction case. This former prosecutor sent 2 homeless black men to prison for life for a murder where 1, witnesses couldn't pick them out of a lineup, 2, neither men matched descriptions provided to investigators, and 3, prosecutors made secret deals with jailhouse informants for biased testimony, and none of this information was ever mentioned to the jurors. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm glad that you framed it with this is a rare type of repercussion, because it is. And when you see the numbers where you see the number of folks that were wrongfully charged and served terms, it's a reminder for all of us that when we're talking about reforms, we can't just focus on police. We have to look at the entire spectrum, especially the race disparate spectrum in the criminal justice system. What you're alluding to and why this is so rare, we've been having conversations in the past about qualified immunity, but for prosecutors, there's an absolute immunity. And that's why seeing repercussions like this is so rare. Absolute immunity was created in 1976 from the Supreme Court. And essentially what it means is that prosecutors cannot be sued for misconduct related to their advocacy in court. And that includes information where they falsified evidence or they haven't turned over exculpatory evidence. And the only repercussion, and this is the repercussion that we are seeing, where we're seeing an action, is the lane evolving where they're held accountable within the profession. So there's disbarment. And the counter to that from policing is if we have some sort of post-certification where we're evaluating the very profession, where people are allowed to engage in the profession after they've engaged in misconduct. The reason we're having this conversation is because we don't have repercussions from the prosecutorial side for criminal charges related to advocacy, and you can't have repercussions for civil liability. So they can't face lawsuits because of this absolute immunity that we were talking about. And this is before we start having the more complicated conversations about proactive intent and proactive actions from prosecutions to re-examine and look at things like retesting DNA or looking at revamped fingerprint knowledge that has become available using technology to reevaluate old cases to determine whether.
Yep. I think we lost Paul. I think he muted us for a second. All right. Well, I'm being told he's back. Hey, Paul.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know what
you
happened.
Had us on
technology.
Mute.
Yeah.
All right. What were you saying?
Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that, like, what the answer is, I think, in terms of we've defined the problem. I think what we need to do in terms of next steps, in terms of defining best practices, are looking at prosecutorial agencies now to lean in and partner with agencies like the Innocence Project or Prosecutors Alliance and start looking at one of two things. One, reviewing evidence in old cases, and then two, trying to institutionalize best practices to make sure that we don't have the misconduct behavior that we've seen in the past and that we're talking about in this story. In this case, where the repercussion for someone having served 14 years in custody is an attorney at the end of his career being disbarred or not being able to practice. We have to look at our agencies, and as a prosecutor, this seems like our call to action, now that we're aware that these things are taking place, on what to do moving forward to build out best practices to ensure that there's safety, specifically for communities of color that have race disparate outcomes from prosecution. And that's, again, those are just facts and statistics that we don't get to argue with. They exist. Now the question remains, what do we do and where do we go from here?
Yeah, because I mean, you just laid it out, right? Qualified immunity, for so long, people couldn't understand how that protected police officers. And now you laid out what absolute immunity does for judges and prosecutors. And I'm thinking that we need to do away with that, because we talk about officers who take the lives of people by using excessive force, and they are prosecuted criminally, but we don't think about prosecutors taking people's lives in the same sense, right? Because it isn't, but they're sending people to prison for life, and they're taking away years of life from people. And in these two cases here in Dallas, these were capital cases, so death row. So they would have gotten, the death penalty because of what they, allegedly did, and they were proven to not have done it. So I think we should treat prosecutors the same as police officers. So quickly, I want to get your thoughts on the Allegheny County DA, though. They're asking for people in the community and nationwide are asking for him to resign. And basically, he's been in that position for almost a quarter of a century, Paul, and no one has paid much attention to a lot of the racially biased decisions he's made. Might this finally be the thing that leads him to being voted out of office? How do we get people interested in DA races? This is precisely the kind of case we have to highlight for people.
I think in having the conversations like you're having now and making viewers aware and understanding that the qualified immunity conversations that people are concerned about correlate in prosecution to the absolute immunity that exists for prosecutors. And it's just as you said, the loss of life and the loss of years from lethal force from the police does translate into the loss of life that people face from prosecutorial misconduct. And we have to have accountability across the spectrum. And so connecting that to the significance and the importance of prosecution, which is exactly like why folks like you and I became prosecutors in the first place, to improve the system, are the things that voters need to bring to the ballot booth to evaluate who is going to define public safety in a way that doesn't give us race disparate outcomes. That's the conversation. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why you have your show. That's why we have audiences that learn from us and take that knowledge to share with their friends, their neighbors, their community into the ballot booth to make sure that the prosecutors that they are elected have just the same standards as we have for law enforcement and our judges as well.
Couldn't agree more, Paul. All right, BNC's legal contributor and veteran prosecutor, Paul Henderson. Thank you, as always.
Thanks for having me, Yodit.